about entity forms, entity views, so on and so forth. We started last week, and we started looking at content snippets. I have placed an example. I think it's part of the video. If anybody has questions on it, we can talk about it again. But the plan is to cover entity forms, entity views, uh, talk about entity permissions as well. I know there are some folks who had questions on permissions, so we'll try to address all of them. Hopefully, we'll get those covered. And yeah, let's get going. So I put a new portal up last week, and it is the portal that I did the demo on dark mode. It's a little bit cleaner in terms of having sample pages and whatnot. So we'll use that one today. If you want to take a peek at the portal, it's available publicly as well. So I'm going to throw that on the chat if you want to have a look at that particular portal. Pretty vanilla. Outside of the dark mode thing, there's nothing to it. So we'll use this guy. Um, and come on. Okay, my machine kind of it froze up. So let me throw the link there. All right, so it's there. Okay, so last week what we did is we went to Studio, Portal Studio, and we created a form from there. Now, this form is a little bit different than the usual forms, if you will. Reason being is because usually when you're creating the forms experience, you usually start with an entity list, and from there, as users click around or click on a record to edit the record, you show an entity form as a pop-up. So if you look at the context and if you inspect the HTML behind that experience, you see that the entity list is actually pushing the ID of the record to the entity form. Um, and when you set up forms from Studio, it doesn't give you the opportunity to select what kind of record source you want to use. So again, it will assume that the record source is an ID that's coming from the URL. And in this example, that's not what we did. On this particular example, what we did is we configured the form's data source or record source to be the logging of the user, the ID of the user that's logged on. Unfortunately, Studio doesn't give those options here. So in this example, what we did is we created a form and then we went to the back end to complete the configuration. So if it makes easier for you in terms of design to start that experience from Studio, because then you can select properly where that form is going to land. You can start from here, but you will need to go to the back end to configure the form. So I started here. I gave the form a name. I selected which table, or for those who are legacy Dynamics developers, the entity that we are to use and the form that we are supposed to use. Again, this particular editor or this toolbox does not have nearly, I'd say, 10% of the properties or configuration inputs that entity forms have available. So we're gonna quickly jump back into the portals management application, the model-driven application. I'm gonna open the form and you see what I mean. So on Studio, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 9 properties that we can configure. In here, you have a lot more, okay? Another thing that I wanted to point out that Studio makes it really nice is that you can hop to the actual data verge form right from Studio and make changes to it. So for example, if you selected a data verge form and you don't like the field disposition, you can navigate straight to that form from here and make changes as you desire, which is really cool. Okay. Again, let's not mix data verge forms with entity forms. Data verge forms is where you pretty much define the layout of your form. The entity form record is how you configure that form to be exposed through portals. All right. So now I am on the entity form record. Some of these initial settings were defined through Studio. Again, the name of the entity form, so on and so forth. And the other fields we'll look into them now. So I have defined my entity mode for the form as edit. You can have as insert, edit, or read only. Okay. The record source type I've defined as current portal user, which means if an unauthenticated user lands on that page, they would get an error. Okay. Then the website and whether or not I want to enable entity permissions. This part is really key, and we're gonna look at entity permissions today. But the idea is the security level that we have in Data Verge to control who sees what records, who is able to edit records or delete records. We have a similar control within portals. Now, for portals, instead of having business unit type configuration for security roles, what we got is different levels of security that are based on who owns the record or who is associated with the record. And by that, what I mean is you can configure entity permissions to allow users to change contact records of the account that they work for or they are associated to. Even though you may have thousands and thousands of contact records, when this particular user logs in, you'd only be able to change contacts of the company that he is associated with. Or if you don't want at that level, if you want to restrict to the user, you can configure entity permissions to say this user can only change his own contact record or records associated with his contact record. So we'll look at the details on entity permissions, but when you create a form, if you select entity permissions, you need to make sure that you have permissions that allows this form to function correctly. All right. Form options. Whether or not you want to add CAPTCHA, and CAPTCHA is that the little text that you put in to ensure that the user is a real user. It's not, a crawler, a web crawler, just submitting data into your database. You can do validation groups. If you have web resources on your data verge form, you are able to render those here. And the caveat here is that your web resources, they must function without any dependencies to data verge. And again, by that, what I mean, if we have folks here who are familiar with JavaScript programming, Data Verge, or Dynamics 365, sometimes you have resources that are dependent on the client context file of Data Verge. Those will not function here because when you render the resource is not aware of the Data Verge backend. When you render those resources within portals, it doesn't have any context to connect to Dynamics in the backend. But if you have a resource that is an image or a logo, those will function correctly. You can add some CSS validation. to your form. You can add custom instructions. If the record is not found by the time that the user lands to this form, you can put a custom message, so on and so forth. Moving on here, success settings. What happens when the user hits save or submit? Do you want to display a success message? And do you want to hide the form? If you want to hide, you can check this option and it would hide the data fields for that form. Okay, additional settings. You can override some of the buttons that are displayed on the form. So I only have a submit button configured. So I don't like the term submit, so I call it update. You can enable delete. If you have a workflow bound to the particular record type associated to the form, you can also invoke that workflow from here, which is cool in my opinion. Create related record, activate or deactivate the record that's displayed through that form. Entity reference. Suppose that on your form, you have a lookup field to another entity. So the first form we are creating is called student profile, but I will create other forms for my example where we'll be able to enter, for example, courses that myself as a student wanted to enroll, right? So when I create those forms, I can click yes here on entity reference, and I can configure the lookup field on that secondary form to be pre-populated with information that it's either available through the URL or through the user that's logged on, okay? And again, for my student example, doesn't really work, but we'll look at that as well. And hold on, I think I cruised through this part too quickly. There is a bit more to it. Let's say that you're dealing with a record or form that has a reference to the user that's logged on. Suppose that you created an application that's collecting, it's a case management, and the form is for case submission, okay? You can click on this option here and select the field that relates to the contact user on that particular entity. And when you save your form, it will populate that field with the current user's ID. Okay. You can configure a file attachment to your form by clicking here. Now, a couple of things that have to be in place for this to work. First is you need entity permissions on the notes entity in Dynamics. Otherwise, you're gonna mark this and that's not gonna work, okay? And then the second part is you need to configure where you wanna save these attachments, okay? Attachments can be saved in the Dataverse database or Azure, but the Azure part includes in-course configuration. So we'll bypass Azure for today. All right. You can filter what type of files you want to allow through the upload. If you want to allow PDF, Word documents, so on and so forth. And error messages. So if the file upload is required, you can add a message here. If some of the files that the user is trying to upload is not accepted, you can throw another custom message here as well. You can also limit the size of the files that you want to allow to come through this interface. One really cool option is geolocation. You can enable geolocation and collect the Latin launch from the device. It could be from a cell phone or a browser. All you need to do is enable that option and then select which fields in your entities are supposed to map to that piece of information. I think somebody has raised their hand. Go ahead, Kurana, I think is your name.
Hi, Victor. Yeah, it's good. I've got a question regarding the restricted file types.
I'm so sorry, I can hardly hear you.
Hello, can you hear me now?
I can hear you better now.
Oh, thank you. Victor, I've got a question regarding the restricted sort of file types. I remember in Dynamics, it automatically populate what type of sort of harmful file type it won't allow you to access. So in this case, can you actually restrict those, for example, exe files or
Yeah,
malicious extension files?
yeah,
Does it
you can do
automatically
that.
take into account, or do we have to manually input those file extensions?
You can put the MIME types here. So for PDF, it's gonna be application, I think /PDF. So you can do it here, comma separated values of the MIME types, and that would filter what can be uploaded or not.
Thank you.
Okay. Javier has asked a question. We cannot invoke cloud flows at this stage, Javier. It's a bummer. But yeah, we cannot. Only workflows that are local to data verge. I mean, can still hack it a little bit, but it's not native to cloud flows. You could use a workflow or an action to call a cloud flow, but not super elegant. But you could still get the job done that way if required. And then the last part here is JavaScript. So you can throw some JavaScript onto your form. And I think Nick Doma just put an example up where he moves fields around the form. So you can use jQuery to do that. I think the next lesson would be around JavaScript on the 25th. So we'll play with this guy as well. So jumping to the last tab here, entity metadata is really cool. I mean, the purpose of entity metadata is essentially to format some of the fields that you have on your form in a way that's more user friendly. And there are many options here. I'm just gonna cover one of them, actually a couple. So let's go to attribute. Attribute is a field on the form. So you can select one of the fields from the form. I'll pick city as an example, just to show what options we have here. So you can change the control style. You can change the CSS. You can do value pre-population through metadata as well. So if you know that it's an option set that you have on your form, but two portals that can only be one option selected, or there should be a default on portals but not in data verge, right? So you can control that through entity form metadata. The other option, I mean, there are many options here. You can do a timeline control, but the other option that I use quite often is the subgrid. And what it is a lot of the forms that we play with may have a main record in context and then a bunch of associated records that are related to that form, right? So instead of us building a whole uh, um, liquid template with a lot of references to entity lists, a lot of references to a bunch of things, what I usually do is I created a form, and my form will have different tabs, and I decide which tab to render at any given time. And for the grids, I just use subgrids within that form, and that works really great the majority of time. I'll show you an example that I have used that particular experience. So on this site, I was asked to do a control panel for patients, and there were multiple data elements associated with a particular patient record. So instead of building multiple entity lists, what I did is I built one form at the contact level and then multiple grids associated that are associated with that contact record. So let me show you. So this is one form. It's not in production yet, so don't mind the style here. But this is one form. You can see there is one grid on this particular tab that users can delete. They can search. I can navigate away to another tab on the same Dataverse form and just navigate away. I can click to edit a record, see the record. So this particular implementation uses entity metadata for grids. Okay, so let's jump back to our example. I'm gonna go to the portal itself, sign in, and navigate to the student profile form. All right. So this is my student profile. Okay, that's the form. I don't like how the height is working on this form. So what I will do here is I'm gonna break the address part into another tab, and then I'm gonna add other different tabs here to display how we can work with entity metadata. So in order to do that, I'm gonna jump back to Studio and access the form. So this is the Dataverse form itself. So in here, I'm going to add another tab. Right, I have my tab. I want to move it over here. I'll call this tab address. Name it accordingly. Go ahead and save. Let's see if I can move some of the components from one place to another. Not sure if it will allow me to do that through the editor. It did. That's amazing. All right. So let's delete this section. So now address is out of the picture. I'm gonna add another tab. I'm gonna call it course sessions. Save that guy. All right. So in here, now I want to add a grid to an entity called course sessions. Show related records. Oh man. Yeah, these editors are not super great yet. Okay. Okay, I have my grid here. I'm gonna give it a name. The grid. Right. I will hide the label. All right. got all I need. I'm going to save and publish. So my form has changed, okay? Now, what I need to do is I want to go back to the student profile form, make sure that it's selecting my first tab. It is general tab. I'm going to create another entity form. Actually, I'll create two more. I'll call this student profile dash address. Select the contact entity here. Student form portal is the one I'm using. I'm gonna select the address tab. Okay. The mode is edit. The record source type, current portal user. The website started and entity permissions activated. Save that. And I'm gonna create another one. File. This is going to be course sessions act student portal course sessions is the name of the tab I gave. Edit current portal started start save. So we're good to go. Now on this one, because it's a grid based form, if you will, I'm gonna jump to the entity form metadata, click to create a new entity form metadata record. Then in here, I'm gonna select subgrid. Then I will select my grid course sessions. Wait a little bit. Save my record. Now, there are more things that we can do here. For example, we can add a create form for this grid and an edit form, but let's compose our form through Studio first. Then we can get back here and make some changes. So I am back at Studio. I have my form, my original one here. So what I will do is I'm gonna look at the source code for this guy. And first of all, I want to add a navigation bar for that. So I'm gonna hop back to my example and get some code snippets that I have for that, and we'll go from there. All right. So I have a grid here with 12 positions set up, or a div with 12 positions. So I'm gonna make this guy 9, and I'm gonna create another column here. Okay. And I'm going to throw my navigation option. I don't need all those items. So this is general, this is address, and this is going to be course session. gonna save this to see how it's presented. Yeah, let me take this extra div out of the picture here. Save. All right, so you can see that I have some sort of navigation going on here. Okay, so again, back to my sample, look at the tabs that I have in place for the presentation of forms. And okay, oops. I'll post this HTML for you folks to see afterwards. Go back to my code. HTML in here. Okay. Let me delete some of these guys as we don't need them all. And then now I'll start the composition. So I have this empty form called student profile that I'm going to throw it right over here. Then we have some other forms that we created. And if I'm not mistaken, we have address, and we have course session in place. I'm going to clear contents of this div and bring my items over here. I know that this may look like a lot, but it will make sense in the end. So the only last piece here for this experience is making sure that this tab panes match the IDs that we have given. So for the second tab, we call it address for the menu. And then the third one was called course session. All this all in here. Save. Okay, it's saved. I can now go back to my portal and refresh this page. Whoops. Okay. Record cannot be found. Picked address. Okay, let's see what mistake I have made on the first form. Form name called student profile. Yeah, we have one called student profile. What is it complaining about? Okay, entity form. Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's saved as query string, so let's move it back to current portal user. Save. Cache. So that's my form, address, course session. Not sure why it's not showing the grid here yet. Maybe the name of the form I given is a little different than what I put it on the code there. Yeah, course sessions. Let's see if I had put it in plural. Come on. Let's look at the code. Yeah, course sessions. So yeah, that is my grid. You see how it's showing that I don't have permissions? We're gonna fix that. So fairly quick to have this type of experience. I mean, I think if you had to do it by hand, it would take a little longer, but it's there. So let's now navigate to the model-driven app, and let's jump into entity permissions. So the entity that it's failing here on Portal is called course sessions. So we're going to create an entity permission for that. Uh, let's just step back just a little bit. Notice that I've created a contact permission that's scope of self. What it means is that I can only change data related to my user record or my contact record as a user. What I can do from here is when I create another entity permission for course sessions, I can build on top of the same concept. So I can say, I can give it a name, course sessions for contact, or even better yet, for logged on contact. And we're gonna look up the course session entity here. We'll define to which website is this entity permission related to, and then we have scope. Global would mean that this user would have access to change or whatever permission we grant down here at the bottom, this user will be granted to do regardless. Contact, it's at the contact level if any relationship on that entity associates with the contact. Then you have account, the account that my contact is associated with. So if I was an admin for multiple students, as an example, in the same school or in the same group, I could set it up this permission this way. Parent, it is what we're going to use in this particular regard, because there is already a permission at the contact level. So what I will do is I'll cascade the same permission that exists at the contact level down to this particular entity. In other words, if I am only able to either read, create, append, write, delete, or append to course sessions that are associated with my contact record, all right? So I can select the other entity permissions that were created before this one. I can select the relationship, and then I can give rights. So this user is able to read, create, append to, delete, and write records. And now I'm good to go. If I come here, clear the cache, and refresh, I should be able to see my grid. So now, instead of having a failure, I have a message that says there are no records to display. All right. So the last step we're gonna take now is to allow a user to create a record and add a record on this entity. In order to do that, I go back to the model-driven app. Again, I could start this process from the studio, but there are just too many steps at the entity form level that I don't think it's a viable path at this stage. So we can go to entity forms area, click new, then we're gonna, I usually use this notation. I give the name of the entity so that it's easier to find on the list afterwards. And this form is going to be used for creating new records. Type insert, start a portal, enable entity permissions, so that's good to go. Then I'll create another one here for editing a record. Course session, edit the form information tab general. This is gonna be edit. Now on this scenario, we are not giving the current portal user context to this form as the record source type. What we're gonna do is we're gonna do query string, and I'll show you why. Starter portal entity permission enabled, save. Then what I need to do now is I need to navigate back to the entity forms listing, and then I'll go to the particular entity form that has the grid, open the form, then I'm gonna go to the entity form metadata. I don't know if you recall, we created in metadata a metadata record to display the grid. Open that up. Then in here, oh, I clicked on the form, sorry. I have to click on the record to open the record. Then in here, I'm going to select the forms that I want to use for creating and editing course session records. So create, I now have an option here, edit, an option there, and I also want the user to be able to delete a record. So I can save this item, clear cache, and refresh my screen, and we should be able to see those options now. All right, you see create option. Click to create. It takes a while on the first load. Sorry, we are 2 minutes over time. Sorry about that. Yeah, so as you can see, here's my form. I would have to configure entity permissions at the course entity level to be able to see those records. If I click on student, this should be pre-populated with the logged on user. I think we'll stop for now, and then we pick back up on the next lesson to complete this example. But this gives you a good run of the entity forms and the power of creating the subgrids. I mean, you can create an entire system just using this strategy of form subgrid, entity forms, and then entity metadata to add these related records. All right, I'm gonna stop sharing for now, open the mic for a few more minutes. Arjun, I know you have some questions in regards to entity permissions, but before we go there, let's open the forms for folks who want to ask questions. Any questions on chat, or anybody who wants to speak? Go for it.
Yeah, I've got a question. So in the entity metadata, we saw the option for download. Are there limits to that download? Does it download the page that you're on of your entity list? Does it download the entire record set?
Right here, it is a download, much like the Dynamics on the data version. Like downloads an Excel file. It will pick the whole data set, but I think with the limitation of 50,000 records, of course, right?
Yeah.
I don't think, maybe you can hit that, but in the context of a contact record, usually it'd be very hard to have more than 50,000 records to be downloaded within portals. But yeah, you get an XLS file, Excel, yeah, an Excel file. Yep.
All right, thanks.
All right. Cheryl says it was a great session. We'll be trying this out at the weekend. So yeah, let us know how it goes. You can always post in the Ching channel if you have questions. We have many heroes now who can answer. Yeah, awesome. Anybody else?
Hi, Victor. This is Mark. Got a question. It's regarding one of your past sessions. Remember when you showed us that you could hide with some fields on forms using JavaScript?
Yeah.
And some of the fields, they kind of had the same behavior as when you hide fields on in Dynamics 365, where kind of shows and hides right after. Just wondering, are you able to avoid that? Because it's not something that I feel would be very desirable in a portal. I mean, it's kind
Yeah.
of acceptable in Dynamics 365, but when it comes to a portal, I wouldn't want that.
Yeah. So what you can do, Mark, um, every component that we saw is contained upon a web page record, right? And if I don't know if you recall, but web pages have web localized contents, which is actually what's presented to the user, right? At that particular record, you can set up CSS so that on first load, it hides the fields that you don't want to present to your user. So let me quickly share what I mean. So if you go to a web page, so for example, home page, and then you navigate to the localized content, and where is that at, Victor? Yeah, custom CSS. What you can do is you can throw your CSS here to hide the fields that shouldn't be displayed when the page first load, and then you can do JavaScript to present them as the user selects or does whatever onto the form.
Okay, so you're not gonna get the fields flashing
Yeah,
or appear and then disappear. Okay, okay, that's cool.
so yeah, you can do it here because the strategy that folks use is they put a lot of configuration onto the what is it called, the ready event, right? But then you have to wait for the whole page to load, and then you start hiding stuff. But if you throw it on the CSS here, it will be hidden on first load.
Okay, let's see, Victor. So it's appreciated.
All right, all right, cool. I will stop the recording for now. If nobody has additional questions, I know Arjun, you had a few questions that you wanna ask. Do you feel it's appropriate to ask it here, or do you wanna do it in private?